Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Sudhakar. I'm the founder and CEO of Astuto.ai. We are a SaaS company focused on helping businesses with cloud governance and optimization. Our platform, OneLens, is used by many fintech companies, software businesses, and enterprises, and we help them run efficient and optimal AWS infrastructure. We are very excited to be hosting this webinar today to talk about unit economics with Stephen Old. Stephen is a leading voice in the cloud FinOps space and has been pretty much in the space ever since the term cloud FinOps was coined. He heads the FinOps at Sinega, a leading ITAM, FinOps, and GreenOps consulting company in the UK. We all know that FinOps is all about driving accountability and collaboration to manage cloud costs effectively. But while cloud cost visibility and observability are foundational, they alone don't tell the full story of the value delivered. That's where unit economics comes in. It helps connect costs to business outcomes so you can make informed decisions that scale profitably. Hello, everyone. Stephen, absolutely pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your time, and the stage is all yours.
Oh, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. I'm going to just run through a few slides, guys, just to give the basic idea. But my real hope is that most people realise as we talk about this that actually none of this is particularly new or complex. I'm actually there. It is. Oh, it's the green button in the middle. I was looking everywhere else except for where it was quite obviously share. I now can't see the chat, so if anyone lets me know if there's a pertinent question for me to stop, I might just try to get it back open on the side over here. Wonderful. So unit economics has been around a long time, and I used to do it I used to work in hospitality. So some of the examples I'll give some in gaming, which I've worked in, some in hospitality. But it's something actually that businesses have been doing for a very long time, and then for whatever reason we haven't generally applied it in IT, and that's quite often because of how IT has been seen as a cost center where people have very rarely actually thought about the value that it's creating. And therefore, for IT for a long time, it's been very hard to prove value. So we've got to find a way of making it real for people. And cloud has made that a little bit easier by the fact that it's not a big upfront expense like IT used to be. It's coming in monthly, which has caused all sorts of other problems. Please don't tell me that I think that cloud solved all the problems in IT finance and areas like that. But it has given us a chance because of how we've separated things out and created things that we can now prove value more specifically and more scientifically than we have previously with IT. So a little starting point, I always think kind of why should people be listening to me? I used to certainly think about it when I was young, and I've realised I'm not as young as I was. My name is Stephen Old. I've been FinOps actually for 8 years now. It wasn't called FinOps back then. My first job role in the area was a cloud economics architect, because I was a cloud architect that was really focused on the costs. I was doing big mass migrations. I think the biggest one was like 14,000 VMs, trying to work out what made sense to move against the 6 hours, because it was 6 hours back then. I still think it really is, and that kind of stuff. And I really got into it. I really thought this was one of the most interesting areas. I wasn't finding lift and shifts interesting, and that's the way the market was going. So I moved out of the kind of the transformation piece and really focused on FinOps. I am the joint most certified person in the world. There's a few of us that have a practitioner, engineer, professional, training instructor, and focus analyst. I help write parts of the FinOps framework. I worked on 3 of the current capabilities. I run a podcast. I've specialized in education, process, cultural change, but I've also an SME and have written documents on rate optimization, strategy, sustainability, ITAM, and tools and services. I've built my own GreenOps framework because I'm in the sustainability space, and I've literally managed over 500 million of cloud spend. So I've been there and done it with a very, very varied business as well. So let's go back to when I was a teenager and I used to make online games. And so I had a server, and this is back in the day where you basically just either had one in your house or you went and got like a dedicated server from an organization. So I actually rented a server, and I had a game on it. And the maths of it was relatively simple. I had a server, it cost me about £100 a month. I had around 100 active players at the time when I first started it out, or once I'd kind of got to a critical mass. And so I generally tried to give the game away for free, but I would have things that people could donate for. And what I worked out is I basically needed people to spend about £1 each or $1 each. It was pounds back then. And that would mean I was breaking even. But that's really what I was focusing on. And I started looking at kind of going, I'm hitting constraints. And I'm having some months where I'm kind of getting the £1 game, some I'm not, sometimes it's better. And I was kind of really fluctuating around. And so I looked at it and thought, right, I need to expand, but expanding feels like a massive risk because I'm just covering my costs. I'm adding additional risk on by going bigger and not guaranteeing anything further. And because it was £1 each, I had a look into it. And what ended up happening is I did increase. I took the risk, maybe because I was too stupid not to, more than any level of intelligence at the time. And it's only since I've learned more that I actually have applied the economics back to this, by the way. So I went for a bigger server, which was about double, but it actually allowed me to have 4 times the amount of gamers. It was about 3.8, but that makes all the numbers hard, doesn't it? So I suddenly found that even though I was spending more, it actually meant I didn't have to get the same donation rate or didn't have to charge as much to break even. But actually what started happening is I started making profit, which allowed me to then actually get some additional help on, get a bit of extra things and like add in some new plugins, bits like that, allowed me to then fall in the game. And in itself, when you're purely looking at the sale of something and the cost, and you don't kind of break these two apart, there was no real way of knowing that I would actually start becoming profitable by accident here until you flip it around and start using the actual unit economics, which was what is the cost to me as a business, what matters and what's driving, and by making this change, what am I allowing? And what I was actually allowing was an improvement in my cost per gamer, and that was the unit economics that mattered. And reducing my cost per gamer by actually investing more meant that investment was a really great decision. I didn't know this at the time, right? But now with cloud, where you can test things out and throw them away quickly, because I had to sign another 12-month contract, right, for this service, so it was a big risk. So now the fact that you can test it and throw it away really quickly, you can make these changes, try it a bit bigger, see what happens, and check whether the maths and the economics of it make sense before you push and move across, right? That is massively powerful. You can start making really data-driven business decisions based on testing cycles and stuff like that just weren't possible back when we were doing this. And that's because of cloud. So cloud unlocks this ability for us to start really proving out potential value and potential changes. And if you just think about it in this regard, if you start tracking your cost per gamer or your profit per gamer, both of those are really valid, right? Then when you do a new release or when you do a new event on a game, right? That's a great example. When I do a new event in the game, you can see what events start improving profitability per gamer, which is actually really what matters to you, because it's the per gamer that's driving your cost, and it's your per gamer that's actually what is driving your profits. So you start looking at this kind of going, actually, events like that worked really well. Why? Events like that didn't work. When we released this new thing, no one's really taking it up. It hasn't increased people's usage, spending, and all these kind of things. And so you suddenly start being able to put some science against these things that you were doing anyway and start actually kind of making, right, that kind of event worked. Let's run one of those again in 3 months. Let's see when events are beginning to get bored, when people are losing that kind of normal stimulus. And gaming's a really interesting one because I think, most people kind of get that concept, or their kids are spending money or, want to spend money and buy these packs. So we've all seen it, right? And really, the amount of science you can start putting to that, I mean, the amount of psychology behind it now as well, I don't even go into that, around trying to drive these metrics because they're actually creating business outcomes. If you want to extrapolate the math, this is what it actually looks like, just with my really basic one. And this is what happened over time. Actually, my cost per gamer didn't really drop much. It was kind of a critical mass, and we kind of got that elbow. And this is what happens in a lot of situations in economics and maths, is you kind of get that elbow curve. But what actually happened on the right-hand side is it kept increasing while the actual kind of the unit economics remained similar and the profitability remained similar in terms of per gamer. That meant as long as I knew I could get more gamers, I would keep making more profit. So investment made sense as soon as I was close to that point, and it meant I could also work out the maths of where do I allow it to get a bit stretched and where do I allow it to push and drive, right? And so that was really really useful. So that's one form of unit economics, right? How do we take our costs and turn them into something that gives us an understanding of a business outcome, profitability, something like that? And that's one thing that unit economics does for us. The other thing it can do is it can help us make money real to the people that are creating. So one of the biggest problems we have in FinOps, if we look at how the old world versus the new world in terms of IT, is it used to be when we bought kit, it was like an IT manager, infrastructure manager, CIO, whoever it might be that signed it off. And it would take like a year, 2 years to happen. It would go to finance several times, and there was a lot of decision making. There was a lot of reviewing, a lot of quotes, and back and forth. And then eventually buy it, and eventually engineers got access to it. But there could be a huge lag in that. But it had a lot of checks and markers, right? So because it was such a big investment, a big thing, the accountability sat very high in the organization generally. And that's where all the costs were. So the accountability and the responsibility sat in exactly the same place. When we moved to cloud, budgets often stayed with this person who used to buy the kit, or still possibly does buy kit, in most situations. But the responsibility for generating spend is the engineers, is the developers who are clicking buttons at the bottom. I've seen organizations where there's a gap of 10 roles between those two things, where the budget sits and the actual responsibility for creation goes. So you already have this kind of gap in P&L responsibility, and hopefully organizations are trying to get it down and pick, products or teams have a responsibility for their budget. And that's one of the kind of key concepts of FinOps is around people taking accountability for the spend that they create, right? But that's not always possible. And even when that is somewhat possible, it is very hard to imagine big sums of money. That might sound ridiculous, but for the average human, you can only generally understand amounts of money that you work with on a relatively regular basis. The amount that's in your bank account, maybe the amount that you've had to spend on a car, that kind of stuff. But even that, it feels like, if you spend $30,000 on a car or something in a single transaction, that feels like almost, it doesn't feel real. That money suddenly disappeared. It's gone so quickly, right? And I think cloud doesn't help us with that, because people are spending 30, 40, 50,000 on applications. I've worked with 500 million of cloud spend, about 530 million of cloud spend, right? I can't imagine that much money. I can't imagine what it looks like sat in a room, yet alone anything else like that. And so it becomes really difficult to understand the value of these numbers that we're getting shown on these dashboards. So one thing, I learned this from a chap that actually works for the UK Home Office. What they did is called Demetrius Perdicu, who came on my podcast, very, very clever man. What he did is he turned it into, he found out how much the average UK citizen pays in tax. And then he used that as a metric. And so if they were doing a new project, he'd be like, that is this many taxpayers. Is that a good use of this many people's hard work for a year? Suddenly that makes it real to people, right? I do some work in education, and there we do in the UK, we have kind of free school lunches for kids from certain backgrounds, right? This is that many free lunches. Is it worth that? And on the flip side, where you're struggling to get people to do optimizations and such, because the money doesn't feel real, if you turn around and say, if you do this, this is two people's work for a year. This is your taxes for a year that are just disappearing at the moment because of wastage or something like that. And suddenly it helps these things become more real. In the same way, when we talk about carbon, people like to kind of talk about the amount of trees. People don't really understand the meaning of trees. But if you start turning it into the amount of journeys, about this kind of stuff, it can make a difference. So we can do the exact same in this sense. What is something that's meaningful to your organization that will make money numbers mean something? Because generally people can't understand the size of the numbers they're working with. And it could be like a number of developers. And so the biggest things I see go wrong in FinOps is that people don't budget properly. So planning and estimating, forecasting and budgeting are really key. And if you don't budget properly, that's everything blows up. And a wonderful lady called Ali Whitman gave a talk called cost reductions versus cost savings. And I normally ask people what's the difference, but I'll save that for another time. The difference basically is that cost reductions is just when you reduce cost. Cost savings is when you reduce cost versus a budget. Because when you do that, the company has saved money versus what they thought they were going to be spending, and then that can be reinvested. If you had a budget of 100 and you're spending 150 and you reduce it to 120, you've not saved the company money, you're just overspending less. If you manage to get it below 100, that money can then be reinvested, right? And it's absolutely brilliant. And that's what goes so wrong in cloud so often. People get that budget wrong in the first place, they overspend, and they can never get it back to then be able to reinvest that money. But if you do get those budgets right, and you say to teams, hey, if you reinvest, this money is still available to be used in your department, we may be able to hire additional developers, additional engineers. Suddenly that becomes very interesting, right? We're overworked, but if we can prioritize this, you'll help us get the people that will help us get there. Short-term pain for long-term gain can really help. And that's just one of the examples. That's actually that's the first one I ever did, was number of engineers, number of developers. Not really think of it as unit economic, not really trying to think of it because people didn't understand the value of money, using it as a driver to drive action from engineers 5-6 years ago. Hopefully all that makes sense.
Yeah.
This is something that we created in Syniega to try to simply explain in one slide unit economics. And we kind of talk about why it's helpful, what the definition. I'm not going to read that out for you. It's on the screen now. They'll have the recording for this potentially. You can take a picture of it. I don't mind. But I thought what is quite useful is trying to work out kind of the steps through it. I won't name the company. I was sat at FinOps X last year, and I was on the chalk talk for unit economics. And someone sat next to me and said, we've tried this unit economics thing. It doesn't work for us. We're too big. I said, can we just unpack that for a second? What on earth do you mean you're too big? Oh, we couldn't find one unit that works across our entire organization. I just kind of stopped there for a second. I was like, why did you try? Why did you think it had to be one unit? And I don't think it helps that we call it unit economics rather than units. But I said, you probably the lowest number you could get is 3 per business unit. That will mean you can bundle most things together in some sort of regards. And it's like, oh, it doesn't have to be one. I was like, no, it shouldn't be one, unless you've got a really simple business, in which case fantastic. But even then, you might want one based on profit, one based on, there's still different bits. And often, I generally say you should have a cost per employee as a unit across your organization for your software, your equipment, and all of this. I like there to be a carbon number per employee as well, but that's just because of my GreenOps background. So you automatically probably should have some inward facing and external facing unit economics anyway. But any company can find some value from this. You've just got to be thinking about what your outputs are. If you're not thinking about what your outputs are from your cloud and from your technology, you're in real bother. You're never going to be able to drive that value, right? And one of the biggest shifts we have to do in technology is try to make it a value-driven part of the organization, which we've had such problems with because for so long people haven't understood technology in general. Cloud's only made that worse. While CEOs might be talking on the golf course that they're on cloud and it's fantastic, they generally don't know what's actually going on in the cloud. And there's so many more words, so many more complexities. So we really need to be showing, don't worry about the technology. We've got that bit. This is the value you're getting back from the organization. And I think unit economics is one of the, actually, believe it or not, the simplest ways to start doing that. While quite often it's seen as kind of the nirvana of FinOps, as soon as you've got your costs understood, there is no reason not to start this straight away to start driving that value and benefits. And that's all I've got on slides, just to kind of give people a flavor of the world. I hope that was useful.
Yes, great insights there, Steve. So just a comment that, with generative AI kicking in, I think unit economics is going to be even more important, right? Because especially for end businesses, a lot of generative AI investments are incremental, meaning they already have applications running for their users, for their customers, and then you're trying to use generative AI to deliver more value. How do you measure that?
So we were talking earlier, I gave a talk in London last night to technology leaders in London around FinOps for generative AI. The biggest challenge we actually have is that people aren't thinking of strong use cases before they do it. They're just being told we've got to use it, right? Or we'll fall behind if we're not using it. The first point is you've got to work out what you're trying to achieve. That delivers some sort of metric, right? There has to be an outcome for any investment you should be doing as business, and it shouldn't be any different because it's technology and because it's AI. There should be an outcome. So if you start with that outcome, it might be we want to improve the response from our call center or from our technical people, customer facing. We want to be a quicker answer to a problem. It might be that we want to speed up developer time because I don't know if you've seen this, but Stack Overflow has seen a massive reduction in users
Absolutely.
because people are new to that. I have to say, I'm one of those people, right? I do use ChatGPT to help me with my coding when I can't work it out. So there is got to be outcomes, and then we can take it to that. The other complexity with Gen AI is the amount of different areas of cost and charging that people don't really understand, and whether you're running the models yourself or not. And so a lot of organizations at the moment talk about Gen AI, but they're not really owning Gen AI. They're kind of renting a capability. But in time, as people get kind of more and more understanding of the risks to data, etc., and want to run their own models on their own thing, you suddenly get multiple parts of cost, right? So one is running the models, running the LLMs, which hopefully you're doing over sensible groups of data rather than across everything, which is just a massive waste. So one of the first metrics is cost per run of the model to help you drive in the improvement on your models rather than just using something that's kind of generic and not specialized, because that is a huge part of the cost. I think people don't realize that.
Yes.
If you're doing your own, the front loading of cost is significant. Then there's a piece that I think a lot of people miss, which is around education around prompts, or we used to call them queries, now we call them prompts, right? Same concept. Um, if you're asking the wrong model, the wrong data set, the wrong question, you're paying for that request. You're paying for the tokens. You're paying for the output, even though the output might be in no no way useful because it's asked the wrong set of data. So there's
Right.
training around asking the right questions to the right people, and then there's obviously actual just prompt training in general, like how do I make sure I get the answer out so I don't have to ask like 10 things to iterate to my answer. And there's some training around that as well. So you kind of have to look at the model side and how you improve that, and how you I mean, there's a whole economics piece around that itself, but you can do based on price per run of a model, whether you're batching that, whether you're doing it in series, whether you're treating it like a supercomputer. There's a bunch of different ways you can do that. But you have that piece. And then it has to be around your cost per outcome, which then looks at a,
Yeah.
a slice of the model potentially, but then those other factors to then get there. One of the hard bits at the moment, I know some of you guys have been working on, is breaking down those cost factors because they are so new and they're not always easy to separate and work out what's what. But if you plan with the end goal in mind, where you're really thinking about, right, this Gen AI project is to achieve this, it will have its own model potentially, or it'll be a shared one of a model that's going to be in the right place, and it will be accessed in this regard, then you're kind of halfway there to being able to work out your costs per unit and then the ROI on that. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a
Absolutely.
complicated area where not enough
Absolutely.
people are doing it to get critical mass for people to understand the problem, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I was talking to some software vendors who are building on top of these, generative AI services. For example, if somebody is creating a video, right? So they would be
Mm,
using multiple generative AI services. They would be using text, they would be using video, they would be using images, they would be using speech, all kinds of generative AI services. So
yeah.
for them, eventually what they are charging to the customer is maybe a minute of video, right? So how does that correlate to each of these components, right? So
It's there's two things about JR. I think it's fantastic. JR Stormont came on stage back in June and said AI isn't going to take over your jobs. It's going to give you job security because of the costs that are going to come out of AI.
yeah,
But I think a huge amount of organizations are going to come to the market and they're going to go early, and they are going to cost it based on relatively poor data. And
yes,
they're going to have one or two problems. They're either going to have to increase their prices, or they're going to have to get to a scale very quickly that allows them to maintain it, or they're going to go out of business because it is so challenging with all the different variables that can impact your AI
absolutely,
costs to price effectively if you're not tracking all these things in the correct way.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've seen is in general, it's assumed that unit costs will go down as you scale. Do you think that's always the case?
No, no. I mean, the graph I showed earlier um, actually demonstrated that actually my unit cost relatively stayed steady for some. It had a few fluctuations, but it relatively stayed steady because I hit a critical mass of for the scale for my type of application. Now, because it gave me greater throughput, I still was more profitable, and so that was valuable. But my unit economic remained the same. So there is a scale basis where it balances out. I imagine that if it scaled out long enough over enough time, it would have had a slow downward slope. But that's the dream, isn't it? That we get to that scale. You've got to be balancing it. I think also, as you develop a product, you're generally adding more to it, adding more complexity,
Yeah,
because that's what your users are driving for, which adds generally more compute. So hopefully you're becoming more efficient over time, hopefully you're getting more scale time, but quite often that can be balanced out by the increasing complexity of your products to
absolutely.
deliver what your customers want. And so that's why we're trying. Sometimes your unit economic getting worse, your metric getting worse is okay because the product has become more valuable and maybe it makes people sticky. There's three things. Someone said this to me. They're a very clever person. Three things companies are trying to do: win new business, keep existing business, and cut costs. You can only do two of those things at once. Right? Generally, you can't succeed in all three. And sometimes your business is in a phase where we're focusing on keeping retention because for investment that's really important. They've got to see that people are in long-term contracts, whatever it might be. Then actually, do you know what? It might be okay that your profit drops for a while because you're getting 3-year contracts and that's, money to bank and contract book and all these kind of things. You've got to be aligned with the business. You've got to know what the business focus is, and then you know actually what the path for these are. And it would be lovely to say it always gets better with scale, but then are you developing your product? Are you adding more value? How many products can stand still and win? I don't think many.
Absolutely. And that brings me to a very, next question, which is, uh, so we're talking about the fact that it's not just about quantifying business value. Uh, it's not just about quantifying cost alone, right? You have to
Yeah.
start thinking pricing as well, because
Yeah. Yeah.
if you gave the example of generative AI and Wayfair. I mean, I don't think especially in the world of generative AI, where your input costs are so high, right? You cannot really survive without having that idea of all your unit costs, right? So so you can't really price, I mean, so one is you can't really price in the generative AI world at all without really doing unit economics. But it's very pertinent to the non-generative AI, the cloud applications as well, that your pricing will be much more effective if you do a good job of unit economics, right? And it'll also allow to dig deeper into saying, hey, I have 20 features. How many of them are economically
Uh,
contributing to the
yeah.
overall value, right?
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you said is absolutely accurate. I think one of the challenges that people sometimes even forget is how poorly cost was attributed to outcome in the data center, right? And that has largely
Exactly.
been carried on into cloud, right? And this is why we're having to do this restart, because now people are more worried about the costs. When it was on the balance sheet, as CapEx is, and it was handled differently, it didn't really get worried about. Now it impacts your EBITDA in a different way because it's in your OpEx, it's in your P&L, and that's how your company's valued.
Yeah,
Suddenly organizations are kind of going, oh, this cloud stuff, what value are we getting from it? It's costing the earth and all this kind of stuff. Um, and the better you have allocated and created accountability around the cost, the more detail you can go into, like you say. If you can break it down by parts of the product and then start getting customer feedback on what's important to the customers and those kind of pieces, you can turn around and say, this feature that's costing us a fortune, no one cares about it. Why,
exactly.
those kind of pieces. But you've got to get the business context. And hopefully your organization is getting that business context. But I can tell you something almost for sure, that's not getting back to engineers, right? And it's
True.
Let's connect these pieces. Arguably, we talk a lot in FinOps about products and like product-centric organizations. I know a huge amount of organizations are not product-centric. This is easier in a product-centric world, right? Because hopefully you're already grouping these things. But you're absolutely right. You can go down to the feature. You can go down to, you might have a product set and you can start looking at which you double down on. You can look at the modules. Like if you have like add-on modules that people pay more for that are driving the best value to a customer and jointly the most profitable, the one that isn't that magic sweet spot, and tell your sellers to go focus on that. We've got great use cases. We're getting great outcomes for customers and we make decent money on it because people have got to make money, right? That's how we get paid. And people think it's a
Absolutely.
dirty word, right? But absolutely, the decisions you can make as if you start going more granular, start breaking this down, you've got to start at a high point, right? But you can make such powerful decisions at even the kind of the micro level that are now, well, what seemed micro level, but become common sense.
Yeah. And I think the feature-wise unit economics should especially be made available to the product managers, right? So
100%. Key audience. Yeah.
yeah. So I have some interesting questions from the audience. So a question from Rajesh. He says, how do you select the right business value drivers for measuring unit economics? Is there a framework or
Um,
guideline?
it's interesting. So there's quite a lot of suggestions on FinOps.org if you go into the assets area around different things that different industries have done. But arguably, I would like to say, and I've worked in all sorts of organizations, right? Some of this has been true, and some of this definitely has not been true. Arguably, if your organization has a strong mission, you should know what the outcomes
Yeah.
are, right? And if you don't, maybe that's a question that needs to be asked. You need to build that bridge. What are we trying to achieve here? And start working back from there. It might be that you work on a subsection of the organization and you only, this is kind of concept of OKRs, right? It starts here, breaks down, that breaks down into more teams. Use the same kind of structure. What is your piece of the jigsaw adding to the business? And what does good look like for you? And use that as a metric that drives action.
So
Um, it can be
yeah,
it can be all sorts of things. That's the reality of it, right? And
yeah,
that isn't a great answer, but there are quite a lot of examples on there.
yeah.
I'm always willing to give people ideas on it as well.
No, I think, Steve, I think it's easy for, so I would say we should divide eventually the software or services that are
Yeah,
built on cloud into two broad areas, right? So if I'm building for a customer, right? If I'm building for a business, then I think it's straightforward. It's cost per
or
customer,
yeah, something like that.
margin per customer, cost per, feature and cost per user and so on and so forth. If I'm serving consumers, then it's probably cost per transaction, cost per order, and things like that, right? But I think where people struggle is when they have an internal facing application, right? So, for example, if I have an HRMS, right? So I think every application has a customer, right? So it may be
Exactly.
internal customers, right? So if I am serving, I'm hosting an ERP. So for me, it would be all the users that are serving. If my eventual outcome of the ERP is to make sure that there are no errors, in financial transactions, right? So I think, like you said, it's whatever purpose it is serving, right? Whatever business unit
Yeah.
are you in, you need to know who your customers are and what is the value that you're delivering, and that should lead the answer to the question on, at least the top level metrics that matter.
Absolutely, and you hit the nail on the head. Everything should have a customer,
Yes.
and if it doesn't, why are you doing it? What's the outcome? And it might be that the customer is like one person. It might be that you built something entirely for the CEO to be able to view something. Well, you know, okay, what's important to him or her? Is it that they want the data in a certain amount of time, certain
Exactly.
granularity, these kind of things? There is always something like that, and then you can turn around and say, by the way, we've gone to the second by the second granularity, which means it's refreshing continuously. This is the cost per refresh. And therefore, if you add that across, that's the cost per day. If we went down to the hourly one that I suggested, it will go down to this cost. Do you still think that's good value? And sometimes the answer is, yeah, no, I'm fine. I will take that additional cost to get the value I wanted. And that's fine as long as we're making aware decisions, right? And internal customers are massively important. And people sometimes ignore the internal cost of both applications and people. And we've got to realize that people are the core of your business. And even if you're in technology business, the core of your business, you have to invest in, they have to have the right tools, but that can still be efficient. And therefore, maybe you can spend more on other areas like retention, salaries, and that kind of stuff. It's in the software asset management space, it's one of the biggest like areas is user software that's badly managed, and you're still paying for
Yeah.
someone who left 3 years ago and that kind of thing. But if you start tracking this stuff out of the FinOps space and all the FinOps scope stuff that came out of FinOps XE, we're moving into this world, and we've got the methodologies to start to try to drive it, and to bring more value back to the organization.
Yep. We have a question from Dharmang, and he's asking, what do you do for, like, can you calculate unit economics if you're not on cloud, right? I mean, you mentioned about, the fact that people move from CapEx to OpEx when they were in CapEx in the old, it didn't really matter to them because in the P&L, it was not even showing, right? Because it was a balance sheet item. And today, because it's in P&L, that's why unit economics is a hot topic, right? But the question is, if I'm still, let's say I'm in a bank and running a lot of software on the traditional on-premise
Yeah.
infrastructure, are unit economics still pertinent to me? And if yes, how do I calculate?
Yeah, great question. I know a mix of banks, some that are like and regulated industry, some who are heavy in cloud and some who have stayed entirely out. Quite often people are somewhere in the middle, right? And then you've got this balancing act of, what do you mean I can do unit economics on the thing in the cloud, but not the one that's in the data center? Well, all we have to do to create unit economics is create some sort of mathematics around what the cost of running something is. So data center companies have been doing this for years. When you go buy
Yeah.
a VM or a server, that's what they've worked out, right? That's what AWS and co have done. They've worked out a cost per CPU, a cost per RAM, cost per operating. You can do that relatively simply. Now, you can get into more and more detail to get it more and more accurate. But as long as you create something that you have that you can approve across an audience, a remit, turn around and say, right, this is our estimated cost of CPU because of how we're doing it. We bought this many CPUs. The total cost was this. We're hyper-threading or we're throttling to this, therefore we'll have this many vCPUs. This is the cost per vCPU. Same with RAM, right? And then you create a cost per RAM, cost per storage, and all this. You only have to do that calculation once per installation, let's say, but maybe you just keep an average across the company. You have that metadata somewhere. You look at a VM, you take out those key pieces on its sizing, you apply a cost to it. Suddenly you started doing that journey. You have to work out what I call the gray costs, the cost of networking and stuff like that. That can be a bit harder. You've got two options for that. You can just try to share it proportionally across the amount of infrastructure that's there. So say you've got 100 VMs and something costs £100, charge them £1 each for the switch or whatever. That's a very simple option for it. But you can do that. Or you can decide a cost per connection up front because you say, right, this generally when we've done this in the past, one of these has had 100 connections and do it that way. So you need to make some time. I think you can do most of this. It sounds mad, but you can do most of this in a day. You've just got to come up with a methodology. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to give you the benchmarking ability to work out if things get better or worse. So as long as you keep using the same rule and the same rule is not ridiculously flawed, you'll still start seeing the movement in the direction you want if things improve. But you're basically in the cloud, they're giving you all this data to an obscene level of granularity. You have to create it to a level of granularity that suits you and work it from there. And as an organization, you need to work out what's important. Your cost per minute, your cost per hour, your cost per day, your cost per week, cost per month. And it might be that as long as you're doing it monthly, that's all right. Some places, they have very spiky times, right? So they want to actually understand it to a more deliberate level. And that's probably the hardest bit, is working out the granularity you go into.
Yeah. No, I think making approximations is very important, especially, I mean, even in cloud multi-tenant applications, you'll always have some resources which are shared, right? And
Sure.
even on-premise, you may have some large servers where you may have a large database which will be shared by many applications or services. So I think making those approximations using proxies such as who is doing how many transactions or who has how many users, some kind of a proxy metric you can use to essentially make those approximations. Yeah. There's a question about, this is an interesting question about, so we talked about attributing cost to features of a product, right? But Amay is asking here, like if I want to forecast before it goes to production, right? I mean, how do I do that?
It's a fantastic question. So there are three capabilities within the quantifying business value domain of the FinOps framework that I think organizations get really wrong. You have planning and estimating, forecasting and budgeting, and I keep them in that order, right? Because they lead on one to the other. Now, I used to be an architect. That's my background. So I used to create designs and I used to cost them. And there were two things that really happened here. One, even if you built exactly what I put, it would cost more than I'd put because there are some things you simply can't put in a calculator, right? So that's problem one. Over time, to solve problem one, you can look at the variance from design to production and work out what that variance looks like on average and start applying an uplift to your estimate to then drive into forecast. So I say, like, estimates are a technical thing, forecasts are a FinOps thing, budgets are a finance thing. So in the FinOps space, my job is to take these estimates, look at the expected variance, increase that, put that into my forecast, and then say onto the finance team. The other problem that happens regularly, and this is why it's really important to be doing testing, is the variance from design to reality. I once put a thing together that was about $28,000 a month. What they built cost $40,000 a month. And I had an engineer sit me down and tell me all the things I'd got wrong in my architecture. Very kindly. Once I got over the initial hurt of being told I was wrong, I made sure my next architecture was right. Right. And that's what's not happening. We're not getting that feedback loop of design to build, because quite often these are different parts of the organization. And so if you build that feedback loop in, especially during the pre-prod stages and the test stages, you can reforecast and recalculate. At least you're giving people a forewarning. I've seen organizations design something, the budget holder, long-term budget holder said, yeah, this is absolutely fine based on the cost of design by the architect. What gets built is totally different because it never would have worked. And then they just get it dropped on them and suddenly it hits their BAU budget and it's like twice what they thought. They would never have approved it. It no longer shows value. We need to have these gates in place where we're reviewing for both performance and cost performance. And that's how you do that. And then you reforecast at that stage as well. Do we push this from MVP into production? Should not be a definite yes. It is a business decision and it has to have the value attached to it. Hopefully that's helpful for that.
Absolutely. So what I hear is it's, the process, it is iterative. You need to do that across all the stages. But I think some kind of benchmarking will help, right? Meaning if I have these kind of features that I've built elsewhere and I've already calculated that, I could refer,
Absolutely.
right? If I have an API doing, if I have microservices or I have some kind of a backend job doing similar kind of activities, I think using that as a reference will be pretty useful.
That will help with your variance estimation. We know that we can't get everything in a calculator.
Right.
What's the difference in the past? What have we done when we built something like this? What did it really look like? Can I get down to a cost per API call? Okay, we're expecting this many API calls, therefore we're expecting this. The unit economics makes that easier as well. We've got something similar. This one's simpler, this one's more complex, therefore we think it's a little bit up, a little bit down. But at least we've got some evidence of things in the past.
Absolutely. I have a question here from Jason.
It's a good question.
Yeah, so he says majority of their applications are running on Kubernetes. So how do they calculate unit economics on Kubernetes?
So there is a cost per pod, right? There's a cost per node. So it really breaks down to those points. And if you have, there's like open cost, which is an open source tool,
Yeah.
which is part of KubeCost, which has now been acquired by IBM in the last few weeks, right? But that's now being built into EKS's standard, KubeCost 2.0. So the visibility is improving. Now, if you've got an old COPS setup, it's a little bit harder. But you basically need to get the visibility, and arguably you could estimate it, I suppose, but there are better ways of doing it, of working out the amount of nodes, the amount of, well, hopefully it's not nodes in this case. It depends on how you set it, but it'd be the amount of pods. It could be your namespace. You could be able to work out cost per namespace and that kind of stuff. Depends how you've architected it, but it's about getting that visibility into that area. It's exactly the same concept, just with less, well, a bit harder to get the visibility and smaller building blocks. But you can follow the same methodologies. You've just got to have access to that data. It obviously does do more of this because it's smaller building blocks. So estimating your pattern can be quite hard, and therefore you'll have to reforecast relatively quickly. But actually managing the unit economics, where it's being charged by second, as long as you can separate what's being used for what, which is what you're meant to be able to do, then you should be all right.
Right. We have a question about doing unit economics in multi-cloud environment. Do you think that would be any different? Any new
Um,
challenges that you see?
Well, you're working with two different data sets, right? So you need to normalize whether you try to use Focus for that or whether you do it yourself. But no, the concept is the same. You just need to find a way of making data comparable. That's the hard bit. Like putting the unit economics on the top is comparatively easy compared to normalizing the data to make it look the same. If you're using a tool, they should be handling that extraction for you, and then you can just take the costs and the breakdown. If you can take away from thinking about the technology that's under it and just gather the costs into meaningful buckets, then you can start doing it. That you know, those buckets are the things that drive the outcomes. Then it'll be absolutely fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we already spoke a little bit about, why, like, how is it, how all this is evolving, especially in the AI. But we have a question here which says, how do you evaluate unit costs for AI-based product offering? I mean, we did speak about it, but, we want to
Yeah.
speak a little bit more. Yeah.
So you've got to make you have to separate two parts out, which is your actual running of your models, and then the end piece, which can look so different depending what AI you're using, right? Whether it's generative, it's that piece, but your request bit, or just what the outcome piece is, and quite often you can link that back to the model, but you should still be looking at the model separately to try to drive improvement in the running of models. You then have to make a decision. I think the hardest bit is how you take a model and then work out how you split that across an unknown amount of outcomes. That is really challenging, because let's say you run one model and then actually the piece that runs on manages to run perfectly for a year and never needs updating. Odd scenario, but let's say it does. Well, you don't even know that initially, right? So how do you know? This is the same problem with doing sustainability for software, like working out your carbon output, because there's the initial like cost in carbon of the creation of the software. Then you have no idea how many users you're going to have. So 1 month it might be 5, the next it's 10. Do I split it between 5? Do I split it between 10? Like what becomes my unit? And it can be really challenging. So you need to have an estimate of how many you think you can get. Maybe you get it in test, you'll get some sort of idea, and then use that to attribute your cost. And then if you find out that was heavily flawed, make a note, retrospectively change the data in both regards, maybe keep a saved version of what it was previously, but then turn around and go, okay, we're now saying that this is the new percentage or value that we're taking across from the model into moving forward, because we want to keep it always the same. And it might be that over time that increases, and that's fine, because arguably your value, the less models you have to run to keep getting the same repeated connection or output, the better a job or the better the value is. So you should be changing that metric if you've done it as a percentage or a line cost. And you just have to be willing to accept that and explain that to people. That's how you
Yeah.
prove that the value in time. But that's the most complicated piece, because you don't have to do that anywhere else, really, only in
Right.
the AI ML space.
Yeah, yeah. And we have a related question which says, how do you charge for AI functionality to the customers when we are charged X dollars per X number of tokens and infra costs? And I think, yeah, I mean, eventually, there's so many factors here, right? Like we spoke about video generation, right? So the customer really cares about high quality video of n number of minutes, right? So I think while you can charge, the price that you charge the customer is one aspect, but the cost also depends on how tuned your model is, right? I mean, like you gave the example of prompts, you could actually use 7 prompts to get the same answer, right? So I think I don't think there's a straightforward answer here, but eventually customers will want to be charged for outcomes, and that's why the unit economics is so important, that you measure everything, right? And I think it's an iterative process, that okay, if on an average I am generating a 5-minute video for a customer, and this is what it is costing me. It's not just about charging the customer, it's also looking at the factors on how do you reduce that price, right? How do you improve your model so that you're actually generating a much better video for the customer, reduce the iterations for the customer, and that way you use less of generative AI, right?
Absolutely. What people get wrong is they try to separate how they are charged and how they charge too much too often. And so if you're wondering how to price something, the closer you can align it to how you are having to pay for something, the better. So if you have two parts, which is a model, and you can know basically I have to share that model over X amount of customers, so you're going to pay 5K for your piece. So you have a 4K, 5K underlying piece. Well, I know that if I sell this many of those, that will cover that piece. Great. But then you're getting charged per request. Well, charge them by request. Maybe do it in bundles to make it simpler. You included, you get 1,000 requests. If you go over that, you get charged per 100 or something like that. Because then that drives the behaviors you want for efficiency too.
Yeah.
Right. But you don't want them asking this, 40 prompts to get something that could have been done in one because they do it badly. They have to feel the pain of that if you're going to feel the pain of that. So we've got to try to create incentivized pricing that drives efficiency for both parties, because that is the better answer for both parties. Because the last thing the customer wants is for you to go out of business because your pricing model didn't work,
Yeah.
or for you to come back at renewal time and say, by the way, you've really embedded us now and the price is 5 times more. This wasn't the plan, it's just because you're using it so badly.
Yeah,
you know
absolutely. Yeah.
so yeah, it's a
Yeah,
real
and
challenge.
and if it is really iterative, I think you can go for bring your own AP tokens or bring your own API key kind of a model, right? So, I mean, if there's no other way, right? So that gets takes the responsibility back to the customer, saying, "Hey, I mean, you do a better job of iterating to get to your solution."
Yeah, great
Yeah,
point.
yeah. Um, So somebody was asking, what are the frameworks that I can follow? I think you can go back to we'll share the recording, and Steve had a nice slide which talked about uh, walk, crawl, run
Yeah, you can absolutely
framework,
have that.
and yeah, so
And go on
yeah,
the FinOps Foundation, right? That's, there's a lot of people like myself in the community who create content with the foundation to go out there. One of my friends, TJ, was on the team that created the first stuff for unit economics. It's very good. It's still valuable. It's got some really interesting use cases for different types of organizations. It will just help.
yeah, yeah. We'll just wait one more minute to see if we have any additional questions. Um, any parting thoughts, Steve? I think fantastic questions,
We've covered,
great
so yeah, what
discussion.
fantastic questions. Yeah, I
Yeah,
couldn't agree more. The testing questions,
yeah,
let's say, which is always the best kind. No, I hope people have found it useful and have learned something. We're both always here if people want to ping us on LinkedIn or whatever to answer these questions.
absolutely.
We very much believe in kind of the open learning concept. So, and the better people do this, the better value they get from cloud, which for me then hopefully drives down the carbon. All good.
Absolutely, absolutely. And unit economics is often called as the ultimate holy grail of FinOps, right? I mean, without this,
Yeah,
you really, the FinOps journey doesn't end, right? I mean, so I
yeah,
mean, it never ends, but yeah, I mean, it's never
yeah,
complete, right? So
yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, fantastic. Really wonderful having you, Stephen. I mean, we
Speak
really
soon.
enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and look forward to doing another session in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. And thank you so much for your questions. And I look forward to doing another one soon.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. So we will be sharing the recording to you by email, and probably publish over YouTube as well, Steve. That's okay?
Yeah, yeah, definitely, for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.